perhaps more significant in some ways, in my mind, was the Apollo 8 mission that captured that magnificent Earthrise photograph. And for, you know, when the Apollo 8 was on its 4th orbit around the moon, and they saw the Earth coming up around against the over the lunar horizon, and they snapped that magnificent photograph. That's a new cosmology in the West. You know, you wouldn't have to tell indigenous people, of course, that all life is interrelated and that the planet is a single sacred community. But for a modern Western culture that had been predicated on centuries of human-centeredness or anthropocentrism in Western religion and Western thinking, and you know, and since the scientific revolution, where you had kind of the desacralization of the world, and you had a culture that convinced itself and taught its children that nature was inanimate, that nature was dead, that nature was a resource that we walked around on top of and that we exploited for our own greed. And for a modern Western culture that had perceived and perpetuated a radical separation between the human and the natural world, well, when you look at the Earth from space, that distinction disappears. So it's a powerful time to reflect on the ways in which that photograph of the Earth from space that we've become so familiar with actually represents a new worldview for Western culture. And so it was 50 years ago, in July of 1969, that those astronauts landed on the moon and helped us gain a new appreciation of our planetary unity. But it was 150 years ago, in July of 1869, that the Scottish-born John Muir, who became, you know, one of the great early environmental voices in the United States, arrived in the Sierra Mountains in California for the first time, his first summer in the Sierra, and he wrote this in his journal. You may have heard a slightly different variation of the quote. He kind of changed it a tiny bit later, but this is what John Muir wrote 150 years ago this month in his journal during his first summer in the Sierra. He said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe. And so this kind of interconnected cosmology, this worldview of mutuality, participation, interrelatedness, interdependence, is exactly what Martin Luther King was talking about 50 years ago. And this is an element of Dr. King's work that I've been researching for the last 15 years or so. And I have several articles over here that you're welcome to take on Dr. King as an ecological and cosmological and systems thinker. And so one of the things that Dr. King said often, I've found at least a dozen times, where he says it really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. He said we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So this is the way our universe is structured, Dr. King said. This is its interrelated quality. And we aren't going to have peace on Earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. So I think it's very instructive that this great leader, who we think of as someone in the sphere of civil rights and human rights and social justice, was also talking about cosmology, was also talking about ecology, was also talking about interconnectedness and interdependence. And I think that's instructive, because that's the kind of revolution and worldview that we need as a culture and a society, and that so many of you are involved in, I know, and that it's the kind of work that we're involved in this weekend. So let's have another one. All right, here's a little change of pace. This is a poem called Rumi. Any Rumi fans out there? I can always spot Rumi fans. Rumi. the first whirling saint of poetry, spinning like a galaxy, weaving constellations of words like blazing stars, numinous moons, planets with gardens blossoming and oceans floating in space. Rumi, the first whirling saint of poetry, traversing the geography of divine desire with longing stronger than the undertow of history. This presence is mysterious, like the silhouette of music, the circumference of a dream. When Rumi met Shams, the clouds couldn't keep quiet. They cried at the question that knocked Rumi down. They floated more slowly, hoping to hear whispers from their mystical conversations. Rumi, sending words like flaming arrows to penetrate hearts cold as that December night when Shams was called to the back door, never to be seen again. Rumi, bathed in sacred graces. Rumi, bathed in sacred graces like the wind that fills the flute with notes of longing. I saw Rumi spinning verses in the early morning hours, one arm wrapped around the pillar, his free hand tracing outlines of angels in the air, songs with the power to intoxicate prophets, longing for the beloved whose absence fills the world. Invisible odes built of breath, like God could kiss your lips and transmit words that ride on waves of how it feels when you're together. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sea Festival. Thanks to all of y'all. Come say hi. I'd love to say hi. Thank you. Thank you. Let's planetize the movement.